Could I invite my senior colleague, Mr. Waller? David doesn't need any introduction. Mick stated that the surgical resection has increased from the last decade to now, and David's been one of the flag bearers of dedicated specialized thoracic training. And let's hear from him to say how that's impacted on surgical results. Thanks, David.
Well, first, the very fact that we've got a meeting of so many thoracic surgeons reflects what's happened to our speciality. If we'd had this meeting 15 years ago, a few of us could have sat in the reception area and that would have been the meeting. So we've come a long way, and I'll try and show you why. First of all, many thanks to Sri for his efforts in organising this programme for thoracic surgery, and this is, again, a major achievement, and again, is going to stimulate future trainees to go into thoracic surgery because of the high quality of meetings such as this. There are still a few dinosaurs who believe in a mixed cardiac and thoracic training scheme. Unfortunately, many of these hold senior positions of authority still within our speciality, the wider speciality. And whilst the logical argument favours subspecialisation to keep pace with an ever more complex field, it's still useful for us to have the evidence to support the case if we ever need it. So I'm going to give you some of the evidence why we should have specialist thoracic surgery. We've talked a little bit about the resection rate. I've no problem talking again about it. This is our carrot. The cardiac surgeons are pilloried by their stick, which is the mortality. And for some unknown reason, they have never focused on myocardial revascularization rate. I have no idea why. That would have relieved them of all the pressure they were under, but for some reason they never concentrate on the positive side of their practice, only the negative side. And that's why we have this. The resection rate is our carrot. So when we meet each other in the bar at meetings, we're not asking what's your mortality rate. We're saying, oh, you see your resection rate wasn't as high as it was last year, or do you know his resection rate? He's had 132 lung cancer resections. That's what we should be talking about. That's the positive message that we need to get amongst our community to improve patient care. Many years ago, so frighteningly more than 10 years ago, we looked at the effect of a specialist thoracic surgeon landing in a unit where there'd only previously been cardiac surgeons. And it was stating the obvious, but it did no harm to actually state what the effect had been. And we looked at the two time periods before and after the appointment of a specialist thoracic surgeon to a unit that had previously, and Mick had shown a slide there that showed that unit's resection rate was in the bottom 5 in the UK at that time. And not surprisingly, perhaps surprisingly, the magnitude was the significant increase in the resection rate. And it wasn't that the new surgeon came in and did fantastic reconstructive operations involving vertebra, esophagus, pancreas. It was the fact that Granny got an operation. And that's really what's happened in this country, is that our threshold for operating has changed. And now we don't turn away the elderly female. We think, how can we do an operation that will suit this lady? And that's where the increase has mainly occurred, as Mick has shown. And it wasn't at the expense of long hospital stays and high mortality. Indeed, there was no difference in the use of resources, despite many more patients having surgery. A few years later, with some younger colleagues, we looked at the more wider effect in the UK of specialist thoracic surgeons on the lung cancer resection rate. We looked at the resection rates recorded in the National Lung Cancer Audit, and that has been a godsend for our speciality. And that shouldn't be looked on as their data set, the respiratory physicians. That's our data set. We must contribute to it. That's our safeguard, as we've seen. And we compared that, and it looked at its data containing resection rates with the data from the National Lung Cancer Peer Review process, which recorded surgical representation of MDTs, and correlated that data with our data from the Society, from the Centre for Workforce Intelligence, which broke down where thoracic surgeons were, where cardiothoracic surgeons were. So it's a simple idea. It was a lot of work, and Kelvin Lau did a lot of work to put this data together. Very importantly, it did show there was a significantly higher resection rate in centres with 2 or more specialist thoracic surgeons. And there were many centres at that time that had less than 2 specialist thoracic surgeons. Again, it showed that the resection rates were higher in the base hospital than in the referring centres, and there are many reasons why that should be, and we didn't really get into that with Mick. For me, it's about the knowledge. We're like London taxi drivers. You have to have the knowledge. And it's just about imparting the knowledge to more people. And you've got to take that knowledge out to the community. So when you sit in the MDT, you have to have the knowledge. And you have to pass the knowledge on to the chest physicians and the oncologists, because they won't be specialists. They may be a diabetologist, they may be a breast oncologist. As Mick said, they may have been given the black spot of lung cancer. And often they look to the thoracic surgeon as the guy with the knowledge of what's resectable, what the trials are, what the risks are. So I think it's a question about learning the knowledge, training the knowledge, and taking the knowledge out to the community. And clearly, if you get to those MDTs, you're at the decision-making process, you will influence the resection rate. And I don't know how many of you still don't go in your car or drive to a local MDT. How many of you travel to MDTs? Hooray. Now, a few years ago, there was nowhere near that number. Many people sat in their ivory towers, they tried to teleconference, but they relied on written referrals. And I think one of the big changes is the fact that people have got in their cars and got out to MDTs in smaller hospitals. Now, you do need to rationalise the number of MDTs, otherwise it becomes unmanageable. But everyone should at least have one peripheral MDT they go to, preferably 2. What we also looked at was the start of the process of appointing more specialist thoracic surgeons. So the Trust were getting the idea that appointing specialists would improve their results. And if you see there, the difference between those units, I mean, there was a massive increase in resection rate, even in those units that didn't employ new surgeons. But look at what happened in the units that expanded their thoracic surgical employment. And some of you guys are sitting in the audience were part of that growth. And the massive increase in resection rate by appointing specialists into a unit, reflecting what had happened in this previous unit in the Midlands. And there's some evidence, and this is a little bit different, that the resection rate is related to the number of cases you treat. That's not that hard evidence, but there's some evidence to suggest that, as well as the knowledge, if you're doing more, you're likely to resect more. And we've seen a little bit about this before, but it's important to work out why the resection rate is important. And there's still a debate about what the optimum resection rate is. And this was the data that Mick alluded to. Over 90,000 patients from the National Cancer Repository linked with HES data on resections, and they broke down the resection rate for all the PCTs in England into 5 quintiles. Now, Mick showed a lot of difficult graphs to interpret, so I'm just going to state it clearly for the surgeons. Why is resection rate important? This is if you're asked this by a cardiac surgeon or your trust managers. This is what you say. They won't understand those graphs. A high frequency of resection was strongly inversely associated with overall mortality. Now, that's a very complex way of saying a very simple thing. 5,000 deaths could have been delayed if everybody adopted the higher resection rate, but you would kill more than about 150 more people. So you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Now, Ben Bridgewater has to understand this, that if we go for the zero option of mortality, if we sit under the stick, then our resection rates will fall. Because you'll be sitting in that MDT, in that peripheral hospital, and they'll show you the scan of the 83-year-old, female, arthritis, PS2, and you say, well, I think probably the radiotherapist should see that patient, because in the back of your mind there'll be a little alarm bell going off. If I kill that patient, that's going to come up on my figures and my name's going to be next to that. And that's what we need to guard against, Mick, because that's what will happen, okay? Whether we like it or not, and we can all say, oh, we're going to risk adjust, that's what will happen in the back of your mind when you're sitting on the Thursday afternoon in the peripheral MDT. So, the higher the resection rate, the greater the long-term survival. It's as simple as that, to a point. And I don't think we've reached that limit yet. We're looking at 30% resection rate. I don't think we've reached the top of the curve yet. So, survival and specialism. A lot of data from America. Gerald Silvestri I spoke to him about this time. He was vehement about the number of general surgeons that had done a year or so of thoracic surgery and got board certified, and they weren't offering a good service, basically. So this is general surgeons versus thoracic surgeons from South Carolina, and again, one of the many evidence to show that mortality is higher in patients who undergo surgery by non-specialists, and even more so in patients with extreme comorbidity or the elderly. That's why you need specialists who've got the knowledge, who've got the practice. More data from America. Again, they were trying to make a really big point here about the dangers of general surgeons doing some lung cancer surgery. There were some problems with NIS in America, but it's still probably their best sample. And mortality may be more dependent on surgeon volume than surgeon subspeciality. Again, a different take on that. But the differences in morbidity are significantly impacted by surgical speciality. We'll come back to that bit about mortality not being affected by speciality. You shouldn't really be a dangerous surgeon, whether you're doing a lot or a little. So you should know your own limitations, so you can keep your mortality down, but your morbidity may be affected, and certainly your resection rate will be. So, going a little bit further, and now looking at general surgeons versus thoracic surgeons versus cardiothoracic surgeons. And you can see that in much detail, but the bottom line is in the higher volume hospitals, doing more than 45 lung resections a year, which they call high, the mortality was lowest for non-cardiac thoracic surgeons, less so than cardiothoracic and general surgeons. That was statistically significant. So we're now starting to see in the higher volume, where they're taking on more cases, that there is a safer outcome for specialist thoracic surgeons compared to cardiothoracic surgeons. Again, from the SEER database, surgical volume reflects survival. Those with the highest volume centres had lower post-op complications, lower immediate mortality, and higher 5-year survival. And that's the bottom line, which we haven't really got into yet in the COP, that's got to be our basic outcome measure, and it's just a reflection of the collection of the data, but we have to be looking at our stage-specific 5-year survival. We've started to see stage-specific 1-year survival benefits, but what we need to show as specialist surgeons is that we've impacted on stage-specific 5-year survival. That's why we operate. That's why patients get surgery and not radiotherapy. And so the English data suggested that there was increased survival in those hospitals performing more than 150 surgical resections compared with those carrying out less than 70, despite going into this higher risk group. So there's good evidence now from the NHS to back up the American data. And this is the one you need to quote, is why you need more surgeons in your unit, why you need more specialist surgeons in your unit. This is the evidence that improves survival. Now, Tom, bless him as ever, was always a fly in the ointment and had to come up with something a little bit more controversial. But anyway, just coming back to this point, that what Tom was saying here was, yes, the cardiothoracic surgeons in London that did a few lobectomies, they probably didn't offer such a good service, but they weren't dangerous surgeons. And that's a very important point. We can't go around to the cardiac surgeons and say, you're killing people. That's not the difference between a cardiothoracic surgeon and a thoracic surgeon. They're safe surgeons, they're very good technical surgeons, but they're limited to what they will operate on. And so you wouldn't expect their in-hospital mortality to be higher. So you may only do 10 lobectomies a year, but you're not going to kill any of them because you can select the patients and you can manage them intraoperatively. So that wasn't a good argument, and that really was the point of Tom's BMJ paper. It just shows how, again, misguided Ben Bridgewater is to use in-hospital mortality as an outcome measure, and Eric's done more work on this recently to suggest that. And quality is very important, as we know, not just resection rate or survival, but quality. This, I don't think, has ever been published. It was aired in Europe, got a special session for its own presentation in Essen, and it was cloaked in a more conservative title, but it was basically a presentation comparing the outcomes of thoracic versus cardiothoracic surgeons in a UK unit. And there were significant differences in all these outcomes, and this is what you would hope to see from specialist surgeons: higher resection rates, more lung-sparing surgery, more systematic lymph node dissection, more VATS resections, and less R2 resections. Now, I'm not sure why this has never been published. I can understand possibly why, but this was aired in the ESTS and caused a lot of discussion there, of course. And again, from America, evidence that the specialist surgeons perform more preoperative and intraoperative staging than both general surgeons and cardiothoracic surgeons. And we all know our own cardiothoracic colleagues or ex-colleagues who did not understand what systematic mediastinal lymph node dissection was, let alone could say it. And the idea when I was training was to get out as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And again, further data from America showing that intraoperative oncological staging was significantly done more often by the thoracic surgeons than their cardiac or general surgical colleagues, whilst achieving significantly lower in-hospital mortality and complication rates. So, when you're challenged now, it won't be by your cardiothoracic colleagues anymore, it'll be by your managers. When they say, do you really need a fourth thoracic surgeon in your unit? Couldn't we just appoint somebody that can do a valve one day and some lobectomy the next? It would save us money, all this sort of argument. You can quote the evidence. There is well-published evidence that you can go and source from the UK and from America, and you can say to your managers, this is why we need 4 specialist thoracic surgeons in our unit, possibly 5, possibly 6, depending on your population base. The benefits are improved lung cancer staging, both intraoperatively and preoperatively, improved MDT attendance, increased resection rates, not by performing heroic, ludicrous operations, but by extending the boundaries of operability, by lowering operative mortality, helped by avoiding pneumonectomy and lung-sparing operations, and therefore increasing longer-term survival because of all of those above there. Now, Mick and I were just talking about this. We remember the bad old days, and looking around the room, I'm not sure anybody else was a consultant at that point. Renee might have been. But there was a bad time. There was I think you guys may just have been in training, you may have been deciding whether to do thoracic or cardiac. There was a bad time when we really were facing, there was talk even of general surgeons doing some lung cancer work. There were some general surgeons that were doing some VATS, pneumothorax work, and it was debated about where it would go. And Martin Partridge produced this article in the BMJ, Thoracic Surgery in Crisis. And this was where the SCTS, with Peter Goldstraw, started to plan out. This is where specialist thoracic NTN started at this point. But there's a very pertinent sentence, a couple of sentences in this paper that I'll leave you as a takeaway. You think where we were and where we are now and the benefits of specialisation. One solution to the problem of competing demands involves separating resources. For example, designated operating time for thoracic surgery and enhancing the speciality of thoracic as opposed to cardiothoracic surgery. And I think we're nearly there. Thank you.